Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Handwoven, PieceWork, Spinoff, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed. You're ready to start a new project but don't have the right yarn. Or you have the yarn but not the right tool. Yarn Barn of Kansas can help. They stock a wide range of materials and equipment for knitting, weaving, spinning, and crochet. They ship all over the country, usually within 1 or 2 days of receiving the order. Plan your project this week and start working on it next week. Visit yarnbarn-ks.com to get started. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Ann Merrow. My guest is Eileen Lee. Eileen has contributed knitting designs to PieceWork and PieceWork Special Issues. In the summer 2021 issue, she wrote about her Hawaiian grandmother's efforts to preserve traditional Hawaiian quilting. So Eileen, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
I've worked with you in spinning and weaving over the years, but I didn't realize until recently that you have an interest in Hawaiian quilting. Can you tell me about that?
Yes, my grandmother, both my parents are Hawaiian, but my grandmother on my father's side was the Hawaiian quilter. And she was, at a very young age, she was taken out of school, I believe in the 9th grade. And then she started quilting Hawaiian quilts with her grandmother. And that was just something she did. And as she got older, she realized that the Hawaiian people used to not want to share their quilts. And sometimes they even burned them after they made them. So my grandmother realized that this art was going to die. And all the people that worked on it were going to die off and the art was going to die. So her ambition in her life was to share the techniques and her patterns. And so that's what she did. She spent over 40 years teaching people how to make Hawaiian quilts and sharing all her patterns and stuff like that. So it was over 40 years that she did that. She received several awards for her quilts. There's all kinds of best housekeeping magazines like that they would have, like the 150 quilt of the year, and she would be in it. And there would be several magazines like that, and one particular quilt a lot of times would be in it. So that's what she did. She traveled all over the different islands, all over the mainland. She traveled to Japan. One of her quilts is in Japan. So one of her main quilts is in the Bishop Museum in Hawaii. So she's very well known. My niece got married a couple years ago, and it was at a very famous building. And all those ladies that worked in that building knew my grandmother by her name. So she's pretty well known out there. She ended up going back to school. She had 7 children. And she ended up going back to school, and she graduated with her oldest daughter. So that ended up being a big newspaper article, and it was really a nice article. She's so young, and her daughter was so young, and a mother of 7 kids graduates with her oldest daughter. And then later on, she graduated from college, and she ended up teaching English. Her main thing to do was after all of that, she wanted to write a book. And she ended up getting Alzheimer's. And so that book didn't happen. But she was pretty much ahead of her time, wanting to share this. And I have that quote that she wrote, and a lot of people knew. This quote was, "We the Hawaiian people have made a big mistake. We've hung onto our quilt patterns and we've given away our land. We should have done the opposite. If we had, quilting would not be such a dying art, and we would all be walking around with rent receipts books today." So
that's That's wonderful.
A lot of the articles that she wrote, that quote would be in them. So that's really the story about her. She was pretty amazing. She taught me how to quilt. She made a simple little quilt when I was about maybe 12 years old or so. And she just cut up the fabric, and we both worked on it. You can tell her stitches from my stitches very clearly. Her stitches are so perfect. But I still have that piece today. I mean, it's over 40 years old. Well, it's older than that. So I still have that. And my aunt, her daughter, took over and taught quilting and is still quilting today. She's about 93 years old, but she's still quilting.
What is it that makes Hawaiian quilting different from other sorts of just ordinary patchwork appliqué that you might see anywhere in the mainland, I guess, or anywhere else in the United States?
It's very different. It looks very, very different. For one thing, the motifs are very Polynesian looking, I guess you could say. They're flowers, or there are certain type of feather ornaments, Hawaiian royalty ornaments or things like that. So for one thing, that's real obvious. And then I think they call it echo quilting. So that means that you stitch the motif on, and then you stitch around the motif and around the motif, and it kind of gives you an echo type of look. The original quilts were only 2 colors, so the background was usually white, and the motif was a solid color. So never a printed fabric or anything like that, white and red, white and green, or whatever. So they do look quite a bit different, and they're all done by hand, the whole thing, no machine at all.
The scale of the ones I've seen is really huge too, so none of this, I'll do a tiny block and there'll be 40 of them on this quilt. It's one huge motif.
Yes, she always did king size quilts. All the quilts that she made that I have seen are all king size. So she made quilts for each one of her kids. She's got 7 kids. My father gave me his, which I'm so glad he did. I have a sister and 2 brothers, and I'm glad he gave me the quilt. And it's a king size quilt. So it's, like you said, the motifs are big, the quilts are big.
That's amazing. I don't think my grandparents ever even slept in a king size bed. They were, all the beds were smaller. They had like full size beds forever. So the idea of a king size bed that you were going to make a quilt for.
I know. And she was born, in 1906. I mean, where she, maybe her beginning quilts weren't king size. I don't know, but I know all her quilts that we see now, and the quilt that's in the Bishop Museum and the quilt that's in Japan are king size.
So she learned from her grandmother. Mm-hmm. Were other people learning from their grandmothers at the same time? I mean, I'm just curious about the legacy of these.
I think so. I think everybody was learning from their family, so it just that they never wanted to share them. They learned from their grandmothers and mothers, and it went down in the family, but they wouldn't share it outside of the family at all. And, it's, I think there's a lot of different groups of people that do that. I think the American Indians do that. They don't want to share their basket weaving and things with the other tribes. So I don't think it's that uncommon, but she thought it was not a good thing.
Well, that's the sort of thing where one person intervening can really make a big difference.
Yes. Yeah, this one woman made a big difference, or else they would be gone by now. They definitely would be gone. I mean, they've been copied, I guess you would say, from, coming from the Philippines or coming from China or something, and they like make, and so they're really inexpensive. You see them in the stores in Hawaii. Some of the motifs are printed fabrics, so they've done a lot of that kind of stuff. But when you go to Hawaii and you want to see a real Hawaiian quilt, you go to some of the fancy museums and places like that, and you'll see the real thing.
Cutting out a motif that size must be a challenge.
Well, you cut it. It's kind of like when you made snowflakes when you were a kid. You have a piece of paper, and you fold it in half, and then you fold it in fourths, and then you fold it in eighths, and then that's how you make the motif. You put it on the fabric, and then you cut that and you open it up, and you've got the motif. So that's how it's made. Pretty simple things. And it actually was the missionaries that came to Hawaii that taught them how to quilt. They were teaching them how to quilt their way of quilting. Then the Hawaiian people started doing their own thing. But yeah, it was the missionaries who taught them the original way to quilt, how to stitch and do all that stuff with fabric.
Sometimes old quilts are using little scraps of fabric, but
yeah,
you can't use a scrap of fabric to make a king-size quilt as one motif.
No, it's a huge piece of fabric. And I'm not sure if the missionaries taught them, actually blanket-sized quilts, or if they were making smaller pieces. I have a feeling they were making smaller pieces like pillows and things like smaller fabric, because the missionaries brought the fabric over and would share the fabric with them. And I have a feeling that it was smaller when they were teaching them how to do it.
And now a word from our sponsors. Brown Sheep Company is a 4-generation family business bringing you high-quality wool and natural fiber yarns. We spin and dye U.S.-grown wool into hundreds of vibrant colors at our mill in western Nebraska. Our mill has something to offer for every craft, from our well-known knitting and crocheting yarn to wool roving for spinning and felting. We offer U.S.-made needlepoint yarn as well as yarn on cones for weaving projects. Learn more about our company and products at brownsheep.com. And now back to the show. So the window when this was developed and passed around and taught within families was not all that big then. From the missionaries to your grandmother's lifetime, it was 150, 200 years.
Right.
150 years, probably.
Yeah, about 150 years. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
To have something so big come up and then almost be on the verge of disappearing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the missionaries taught them a lot of things. Of course, they taught them religion, and there's a lot of negative ends about the missionaries as well. But they did do some good things, like the quilts. They also wrote down their language so that their language would not disappear. So afterwards, they didn't want them to speak it, but there were missionaries that wrote down their language for them, and so they're lucky for that.
You did a project for PieceWork Online that was about breadfruit, and it used a Hawaiian word.
Ulu.
Was ulu. So that some of the Hawaiian language was incorporated in that as well.
Oh, yeah. Ulu means breadfruit. I know, such a small little word. Ulu means breadfruit. But it's one of the simplest quilts to make because there's not so many sharp edges and stuff, more curved edges. So that was known to be the pattern to use for your first pattern when you're learning how to do quilting. So that wasn't the one she taught me on, though. I don't think so.
You were advanced.
I don't know about that. I was 12.
In the blood. So when she thought that it would be a good idea to teach people, who did she start teaching?
She started teaching mostly Hawaiian people on the different islands. I remember her telling a story one time that this is what her day would look like. She would go to the park or go to the beach. One day the park, one day the beach. They would have a big group of women, and they would all be quilting, and she would be showing them everything on how to quilt. Then they would go have lunch. Then they would come back, and they would play ukulele, sing, dance, and then they would go back to their quilting. And then maybe about 4 or 5 o'clock, they'd go home.
That sounds wonderful.
Doesn't that sound like a wonderful day?
Yes, we should all be so lucky.
But yeah, I think she was mostly speaking. Teaching Hawaiian people. But then the other types of people wanted to learn. All the tourists wanted to learn, and so she would teach anybody who wanted to learn. She wanted to teach them.
Was she aware of the quilting interest in other parts of the world and other parts of the United States, or was she really focused mostly on the kind of quilting that she did as part of her family?
I think she mostly concentrated on her type of quilting. I actually don't know that, absolutely, and probably nobody could tell me that. But I would bet that she concentrated on Hawaiian quilting and, again, trying to save the art. That was her main thing.
I'm just trying to picture if her work was in these magazines about the best quilts of the year.
Yeah.
And I assume that she would have gotten a copy of the magazine, and what did she think of all of these other different kinds of quilts?
Yeah, and I don't know. I found additional magazines while I was writing this article that my aunt didn't even know about. So I sent the pictures of those magazines to her. There was one magazine that was done that my grandfather entered her in it, but she never saw it because she died right before that magazine came out. So he helped her too with the traveling and the, getting some of the things published for her. He was an electrician in Pearl Harbor. That's what he did, but he helped her a lot also.
And so your aunt took up the mantle and continued teaching?
Yes, and she taught all over the place. She just like her mother did. And she taught, she continued teaching me, my sister, my cousin, everybody that she could possibly teach. She taught for quite a while, too. And she's still quilting today.
Is she still in Hawaii?
No, she right now lives in Washington with her youngest son, Washington State. But she helped me a lot writing this article because I didn't want anything to be incorrect. So I'd always run things past her to make sure that, because she remembers everything. And sometimes she would get irritated with me because I wouldn't say the Hawaiian words right. I wouldn't say them correctly. And and so she would help me out with that. But, that generation, my dad's generation, my dad's 95, she's 93. That's the oldest generation when they were still speaking the language and stuff. Although they're teaching it in school now, so that's good.
This makes me want to pick up a needle and thread and some scissors. Do you do any Hawaiian quilting yourself, or is it something that you sort of have on the back burner?
I have on the back burner. I have it. I have a whole quilt, king-size quilt, all basted and ready. And I've done some needlework on it, some quilting on it. But, it's huge. That's a huge quilt to be working on, if you can imagine. And I think she had like those wooden horses in her house that the quilt would be on. I remember my dad saying he used to, when he was a little kid, he would play underneath them. I think her whole living room was probably the quilt,
Yes. When people were quilting together, were they all working on one quilt, like a quilting bee, or were they working on individual projects? Do you know?
I think they were working on individual projects.
That's a lot of fabric.
It's a lot of fabric. That's a lot of that quilting material too. But yeah, I'm pretty sure they were working on individual. That's the way my aunt teaches, and I'm sure that's the way my grandmother taught too. And that's the way we learned. My sister and I, my cousins.
I hadn't really thought about that. If you are quilting by hand, that's a heavy piece of fabric to hold and stitch into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not bad. My grandmother never used a quilting hoop, I think you call it, but my aunt does. I asked her the other day. I was kind of surprised. She does parts of the quilt. She'll use the hoop. So when you put something in a hoop, you make the whole project smaller that you can work on because you're just working on that small part.
And when you're doing echo quilting, you're working on a small part, but you're working on a big motif.
Yeah, it's getting out. It's coming out, out, just like an echo, just like a water when you throw the rock in it,
And since Hawaii is made up of islands, I love that idea of the waves, waves of the stitching.
Maybe that's what it should be called, not echo, but the waves.
You must be so proud of her.
When I started writing that article, my father just moved into a home. And when I was packing up his house, I found some stuff in there about her. I knew a little bit about her. I was a kid when she was still alive. I remember her. But these articles, it was a woman who wrote a college paper about my grandmother. And it's old. You can tell it's an old typewriter and old yellow paper. And she wrote an article about her. And that's what made me interested in how I can write something about her and work with my aunt while my aunt is still alive. That's what made me think about it. And as I got deeper and deeper and deeper into it, it just got better and better and better. I actually was just going to write this for my family. That was my original idea. And then I thought, I wonder if Kate would be interested in this for PieceWork.
I'm really glad you shared it. I love it.
And she was. It was really funny. She said, "Oh, Eileen, I just love it. And I love knowing more about you." Because, nobody would think I'm Hawaiian because I don't really look Hawaiian. I think I surprised her with that. But this is the first article I've ever written that's not something I made. It's something that somebody else made, and I'm writing about them. And it took me about a year to write it, but it was enjoyable to write. It was exciting to write it. And my cousins and relatives, and they were so excited when they got the magazine, because I sent them all the magazines, and they were just really excited, and they remember things when they were kids, and they talked about what, when she was working on those quilts, or what it was like growing up in that house when they were kids. And it really brought back a lot of memories for them. And a lot of them called me up. One of my cousins sent me money. She gave me a $20 bill and said, "I want this to pay for some of the posting, because I know you're sending this out to our cousins, and I know you're paying for it. And I know if I sent you a check, you wouldn't cash it. So I want you to keep this cash."
In its own way, that's showing support for, wanting to be part of the effort.
Yeah. They were very, very supportive. They really, really enjoyed reading something like that. Mm-hmm. I always thought, well, maybe I'll expand on that for my family and just write a little bit more about her. Although I have to admit, I was a little worried about how much they would keep in the article, because I know you're supposed to be writing about the quilt, right? But they didn't. They kept all that stuff in about my grandmother, which I was so happy that they did that, because that's the whole story.
It's a balance of learning about the textile and the technique and the people who do it. And when people think about researching for an article, sometimes they think about having to go to a museum and, look in the archives. But you just worked on your family connections and learning from the people that you already know.
I talked to a couple of people at the museums in Hawaii, a couple of those people, and they helped me out with some information. My aunt helped me the most, I think, and the information that I found at my dad's house. Between all of that, my uncles and aunts, they're all dead except for the one aunt. And my dad's not able to, he's not functioning brain-wise, so he wasn't able. Although I went to see him after the article came out, and I read the article to him. He was wide awake, and he was with me the whole time I read it. And he was really very happy.
It's amazing how textiles and family stories can really connect us that way.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that Hawaiian quilting isn't part of your active textile practice, but you're bringing people together to work on textiles in a different way. Is that right?
Yes. I have my own studio now. So I teach weaving, spinning, dyeing, and knitting. I've been teaching knitting forever, and for a really long time. And so now I'm teaching weaving and spinning and dyeing. I used to, when my husband and I moved to Grass Valley, we had a 2-year-old son, and I worked and managed a yarn store that opened up here. And that store was open for about 11 years. And I managed the store. I taught knitting. I designed. And I just, right before we closed, I just started teaching rigid heddle weaving. So that just started. And then after 11 years, things got slowed down, and we closed the store. Once we closed the store, then I opened up my business, And, I had to do a bunch of things. Like I had to come up with a name. I had to come up with a business license, location, website, cards, logo, all that. But the location ended up being my own studio, off my own house. So that worked out good. So I don't have to, rent a building, or I don't even have to go anywhere. So that's what I'm teaching now. We have knit nights once a week. This is before COVID. We have Saturday get-togethers that we do. We have dye days. Some of our dye days during the summer usually, and they're out in my back porch. And for a small fee, just to pay for some of the materials and dyes and stuff, we dye all day. We're just dyeing, and especially indigo dyeing takes a long time because you put in a dip and then you have to wait and let the oxygen get to it and see how dark it gets. And, so some people bring their spinning wheels, they're sewing, they're knitting, and we do that and dye all day. It's a lot of fun.
Dyeing with indigo is something that really seems to suck people in.
Yeah.
You start thinking, what else can I put in there?
My family was afraid I was going to dye everything they owned. I was looking for T-shirts. I said, come on, you guys, you must have some white T-shirts around here that I could dye. I was dyeing lace curtains. I was dyeing all kinds, sheets for the bed, pillowcases, and lots of shirts. But I did get into, you weave a fabric, and you have these huge floats in them, and purposely, and the floats are a different color. And the yarn that you're using is white on white, except for those floats. Then when you take it off the loom, you pull the threads from those floats, and it all crunches in, and that's what you throw in the dye pot. And so that all those crunchiness causes the resist. And then when you're done weaving, then you pull that out, and you get these beautiful designs. So that was
yes.
fun to teach.
I think I've heard of that as I think woven shibori.
Yes.
Yeah. It does sound like a lot of fun.
Yeah. People get so excited about indigo. Well, they can feel my excitement talking about it and showing them how it works, because it's kind of like a miracle thing. You pull it out of the dye pot and it's lime green, and then you let the oxygen get to it, and it slowly turns blue. It's pretty amazing. People had no idea how indigo works. They just knew that they had blue jeans and they faded a lot, and
I was going to ask about your sheets and pillowcases. When I've done indigo dyeing, I'm afraid I've had a bit of a problem with crocking, with having the blue rub off. Did you have that with your sheets?
What causes the crocking is if you have too much dye on the product. So the key is to have a small amount of dye, bring it out, let the oxygen turn it blue. If it's not as dark as you want it to be, then you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again until you get the color you want. Versus putting a bunch of dye in the pot, putting your product in there and letting it sit there for 30 minutes or whatever. That's going to crock, because indigo is a pigment dye. It sits on the surface. So that's what causes the crocking. And indigo always has a little bit of crocking, but it shouldn't have a lot if it's done correctly. Dips, lots of little dips.
Last time I was working with something that I had dyed with indigo, my hands were blue, and it was not a fun experience.
No, it's pretty ugly. I don't like gloves, but yeah, it goes away. You wash your hair a couple of times, and it goes away.
That's true. That's a good point. So what other sorts of things do you experiment with in your studio with dyeing and weaving?
I like working with different structures. I'm not the one that follows directions all the time. So I work with a lot of different structures. I like bright colors. I tend to use a black weft a lot of times because I think it enhances the colors more. And small sets. But I will say, the best fabric I ever made was plain weave. And it's plain weave set at 42 ends per inch. And it is the most drapable fabric, the most beautiful fabric I've ever made. So after saying all that about structures, my favorite fabric, I think, the best fabric I ever made was plain weave. I hope to just do every structure I can possibly do in my lifetime, and a lot of painted warps with them. I like the idea of doing painted warps in all kinds of different structures. I did one recently that was deflected double weave, and it was a painted warp, and it had some solids, and it was just beautiful.
How do you approach warp painting?
Well, I paint these myself. So, again, it's just like working in my back porch again. I just make the warps. It's Sarah Lamb who taught me how to do that. And, that's how I do it. I warp front to back when I work with painted warps. So I have the reed on the table, and I'll spread out the painted warp in all the slots that I want it to go in. And then I'll bring in another painted warp, spread that out in the slots I left blank, then get it on the loom. But that's really the only time I warp front to back is when I'm doing painted warps. I can't think about how you could do it any other way.
So speaking of indigo and blue jeans, I know that it's not the only thing they did, but you spent a long time working for a very famous indigo company.
Yes.
In its own way.
Yes. In the 80s, like the mid-80s and 90s, I worked for Levi Strauss Company in San Francisco. I lived in the East Bay, so I commuted to San Francisco. And I was in the merchandising area originally. So in those days, and I'd say the 80s, they used to have a program, a training program, and they would pick people that they wanted to do this program with. And it would be a program that would teach everything you can possibly learn about fibers, fabrics, production, dyeing. And they would send, I say we because it was me and another woman, they would fly us all over the United States on all the different mills, the spinning mills, the fabric mills, the dyeing mills, the washing mills, all these different manufacturing locations, mostly in the South, and we would just learn everything we possibly could. We took tons of classes on everything to do with fabric, everything to do with indigo, and manufacturing jeans as well. And then, I just worked myself up in the management and then became big manager in the corporate world.
You said merchandising. What exactly does merchandising mean?
Merchandising is another word of saying how the product looks, how the end product looks. You own that product from the time that it's just very minutely designed or thought of to how it looks on the floor in the store. And it's how all of it goes together. So on this particular product, say like men's jeans came up with that brown cotton. What was her name?
Sally Fox?
Yes, Sally Fox. They got a hold of Sally Fox and they did a small program with her on brown cotton. So all the jeans and all the jackets and all the vests and all the skirts and everything that went with it was all this beautiful brown and natural cotton. And they did a whole presentation at like a Macy's or something like that. And they owned that whole part of the store where they can merchandise their product to have it look the way they wanted it to look. And that's the only way that it would have been sold. So that's kind of a brief example of what merchandising is. That's one example. But it's really, we would have to go to stores and work with buyers and sell our ideas. And the ideas would be a number of things, not just one jean. It would be jackets and shirts and all kinds of things that go with it. And it's all got to go together. It's all got to be bought somewhat together and be on the storefront together.
So it sounds like it's kind of, in a way, a combination of design and marketing and sales.
Yes, you're right. And at that time, I didn't do it all, but I was responsible for designing of the product. Although I had designers, that did it, and then merchandising it, working with the stores to sell it. And I didn't work with all the stores. We have a huge sales force, but I would work with the main ones, the big guys. And then producing it for a price that would be, affordable. Sometimes that would be in the Orient. Sometimes a lot of times it's in the U.S. if it's any kind of denim product. But the shirts and things like that were not in the U.S. So I was responsible for that as well. And then finance, how much money you're going to make or not. And the bottom line, There is a report that we had called the IPS, Inventory, Production, and Sales. And that was the report we had to put out every month to see how we did, what our inventory was, what our production was, and how much we sold, and how much money we made.
So you said jeans in the U.S. Why jeans mostly in the U.S.?
Well, at that time, we had the factories. Levi had the factories to make them. That's what they did. The whole idea when Levi first started was to make jeans in the U.S. So in those days, the 80s and the early 90s, we were still producing in the U.S. and still had a lot of factories here.
Over 30 years, you must have seen a lot of changes in the way fabrics were made in the U.S. and around the world.
It's like this country can afford to pay for things, denim, jeans, or stuff that come from the U.S. anymore. It's so expensive to produce products like that, and your competitors can produce it by doing it offshore and have wonderful products. The one thing about having a lot of production in the U.S., and Levi is a huge, huge company, it doesn't move. There's not much flexibility in a factory. So if you want to add a little tuck here or a little pleat here, oh my gosh, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
So it's a big machine. And so there isn't any flexibility. So when the market started changing and people started buying other people's jeans, especially men's, men's jeans is what Levi owned, the whole men's jeans market. That's huge. Women's is much smaller. Women's market and everything they do is much smaller compared to men's, and children's is even smaller. But when they started getting slow in men's jeans, then that's a pretty serious thing. And all these jeans that people were in, kind of like indie jeans, they're doing their own jeans. They cost $80, and it doesn't matter because they're unique. That next generation didn't want to no longer wear their father's jeans or their grandfather's jeans. And so business just got slower and slower, and, the fabrics weren't all the time twills anymore. They were making jeans out of, they call it square weave, but it's canvas, different types of plain weave. But it's indigo. It's still indigo, but it's not denim. It's not twill. So the market changed a lot. We just couldn't move that fast. I don't know if Levi has any more factories in the U.S. anymore. I don't really know.
And so now you have the ultimate small-scale, air quotes, factory where you can make any kind of tuck or pleat you want.
And I think if some of the people in Levi that I used to work with knew that what I was doing, they would just be laughing their heads off that I'm actually weaving. Because they used to go to factories and see weaving in a huge scale. A whole room full of looms, loud, really loud. And
yes, and you're controlling your own indigo. It's not rubbing off on your pants.
That's right. I know how to do that because they taught me. I know some sewing techniques that I learned from Levi of what not to do, because the sewing operators were paid by the piece. So this one operator might just be doing this one seam, zoom, over and over and over again. Some of the things that they would get in trouble for is if they didn't change their needles all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Because that would make them stop, right, and do that, so they would lose time. But you can tell on a pair of jeans if their needles are dull after they're washed. And then something else, what was it? Oh, yeah. Have you ever had a pair of jeans where the leg twists, especially when bell bottoms are around, when the leg will twist and all of a sudden your front seam is almost in the center of your leg?
Mm-hmm.
That's caused by an operator. The seam from one end to the other is not matching, and so they're stretching it so that it matches when they sew that seam. So that's what will happen. Your leg will move toward the center of your leg.
All of these secrets.
But Levi was, if you sew, the way the factory is made up is exactly the way we sew when we just do one little pattern. It's just they might be making 150 jeans at the same time. The pattern pieces go on top of the fabric that's put in a location that's put on by these big forklifts. So the fabric is, 4 or 5 feet high. And then this big machine comes around and cuts around the pattern pieces. Cuts the notches, including the notches, and everything. And it's just exactly like the way we sew. It's just in a much bigger way.
So the weaving is totally different, but the sewing is similar.
Yes. The weaving is, is huge. When you're at a weaving factory, I mean, there must be, 150 looms or more in that room. And it's loud. It's really loud with all the beating, and I think when the shuttle goes across, it's loud just with the shuttle. It's similar to the way we weave. It's the same, but it's just bigger. The looms are huge. The bobbins are huge. Everything is just bigger and loud.
I just thought it's so interesting that you said that, men's jeans declined because people didn't want to wear their grandfather's jeans. But you're preserving your grandmother's quilts.
Oh.
So we've been talking about, sort of where you've come from and where you are now. What are you thinking about doing next textile-wise?
I think I want to explore more weaving. Like I mentioned before, I want to do every structure I possibly can, and then I want to do all those structures in painted warps probably. I definitely would like to write more articles. That's something I really enjoy doing, so I'd like to continue with that. I'd like to do some programs with local guilds. And then I want to continue teaching because I enjoy teaching so much. I love to see people get excited about what I get excited about. It's fun. I've always liked that. I think I get that from my grandmother. And then I'd like to spin more. We just got a border collie puppy. I don't know what we were thinking, but I haven't been able to spin much because of him. So I'd like to start spinning again, and I've always had projects in mind to spin and weave with. And then I just would love to be around people again. So I think that's what I'd like to do.
That sounds like a great plan. Well, thanks so much, Eileen. I really appreciate it. Thanks for spending time with me.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks to our sponsors for supporting the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.